America had barely recovered from its revolution when a young French chemist arrived with an idea that would change every future war. His name was Eleuthère DuPont, and he understood something no one else saw. Explosives were not just tools for battle. They were the foundation of an empire. In 1802, he built a gunpowder company beside the Brandywine River and positioned it where water power was strong and political noise was weak. It looked like a simple mill, but it was really the first brick in a fortune that would survive 6 generations. The War of 1812 exploded, and the government turned to the one company that was already prepared. DuPont delivered faster than anyone else, and the United States rewarded them with contracts that multiplied their influence. That pattern locked into place. War begins. Government panics for supplies. DuPont is already ready. Money flows upward, and the family keeps the advantage long after the fighting ends. By the time the Mexican-American conflict arrived, they were no longer a small business. They were the trusted supplier who received million-dollar contracts that would be worth tens of millions today. The real breakthrough came during the Civil War. The Union needed gunpowder on a scale the world had never witnessed. DuPont ran its mills day and night and produced millions of pounds of powder that fueled nearly every major battle. Here is the twist that exposes everything. Members of the DuPont family quietly supported the Confederacy, yet they sold their gunpowder to the Union because that was where the bigger contracts sat. Profit drowned out ideology, and the public never questioned it after victory. World War I transformed their fortune from massive to almost unreal. They provided nearly half of all explosives used by the Allied forces, and their earnings skyrocketed by more than 1,000% in only 4 years. They kept every cent. They expanded into chemicals and plastics. They built a peaceful empire using money earned from war. And when the next conflict came, they stepped right back in. World War II gave them cost plus contracts that guaranteed profit no matter the expenses. After that, every American conflict fed the same machine again and again. The family became billionaires, and the pattern they created became the blueprint for every war profiteer that followed. But explosives were only the first ingredient. The next family found a way to control something even more powerful: fuel. Explosives could win battles, but they could not move armies. That power belonged to fuel, and one family controlled almost all of it. Standard Oil grew so fast that by the late 1800s, the Rockefellers controlled nearly every drop of refined oil in the country. At the time, no one understood how important fuel would become, but the Rockefellers did. They knew future wars would not be fought with horses and slow-moving wagons. They would be powered by machines, and machines needed oil. When the United States moved into the Spanish-American conflict, their products were already feeding the engines of the fleet. World War I turned that advantage into something far bigger. Standard Oil supplied the Allies while using foreign subsidiaries to quietly reach German markets at the same time. Investigators later uncovered documents showing that their chemicals and fuel reached the German military even while American soldiers were dying in France. Headlines appeared. Anger rose. But the war machine still needed the one product only Standard Oil could refine in those quantities. The investigation faded, and the profit stayed. When World War II arrived, the stakes became enormous. American bombers needed aviation fuel that only a few companies could produce, and Standard Oil sat at the center of that supply chain. They worked with the military to refine a special high-octane blend that allowed Allied planes to fly faster and farther. At the same time, some of their foreign partnerships brought them under scrutiny again. Critics accused the company of slow-walking the breakup of a German chemical alliance that supplied the Nazi war engine. Nothing meaningful happened. No powerful Rockefeller faced criminal charges, the fines were small, and the contracts continued. After the war ended, they expanded into petrochemicals, which created plastics, synthetic rubber, and nearly every material used by the post-war military. Each new conflict meant more demand, more fuel, more supply chains that looped right back to the same dynasty. The Rockefellers had transformed oil into a permanent seat inside the American war economy. Explosives and fuel now had their owners. But the next family discovered a way to profit from something even more influential: money itself. Fuel could move armies, but money decided who survived the war and who collapsed. That is where the Morgan dynasty stepped in and turned conflict into a financial engine. By the early 1900s, J.P. Morgan was not just a banker. He was the person governments called when their economies were falling apart. He understood a simple truth that shaped every modern conflict. A nation at war will borrow at any price because losing is more expensive. Morgan saw that desperation and built an empire on interest and fees drawn straight from the battlefield. It started quietly during the Spanish-American conflict when Morgan banks helped finance early military spending. The loans were small, but they created something priceless. Trust from the government, access to the treasury, a relationship that would become the backbone of war financing for decades. When Europe erupted in World War I, the United States claimed neutrality, but Morgan saw an opportunity hidden in the chaos. He began lending enormous sums to Britain and France, long before America joined the fight. Billions in today's dollars moved through Morgan vaults, and every loan carried interest that flowed directly back to the dynasty. Those loans had a consequence no politician wanted to admit. If Britain or France lost the war, they could not repay. American banks would collapse with them. Suddenly, neutrality was impossible. The United States entered the war, and Morgan's financial exposure vanished the moment American soldiers stepped onto European soil. A senator at the time said the quiet part out loud. He warned that America was marching into battle under the command of gold rather than the call of freedom. After the war, Morgan did not slow down. He found a way to profit from both the winners and the defeated. Germany owed reparations to the Allies, and the Allies owed money to America. Morgan bankers structured the loans that allowed Germany to pay the reparations that the Allies then used to repay Morgan. The money looped in a perfect circle, and the bank collected fees at every stage. It was a financial ecosystem built on global instability. World War II repeated the pattern. Before America joined the fight, Morgan helped finance British military purchases. After Pearl Harbor, the United States issued massive amounts of war bonds and treasury notes. Morgan banks underwrote them and earned millions more from the fees. When the war ended, they stepped directly into reconstruction financing. The same bank that fueled the battles now funded the rebuilding and collected profit from both stages of the disaster. The Cold War turned the strategy into a permanent business model. Every conflict required borrowing. Every borrowing cycle passed through Morgan-linked institutions. Interest accumulated, fees multiplied, and the family fortune expanded far beyond the battlefield that created it. Even after the Morgan family stepped away from daily operations, their wealth endured because war loans never stopped generating returns. By the time the modern era arrived, the dynasty had already proven something horrifying. Explosives and fuel were powerful, but control of the money behind war was even stronger. And the next company proved that weapons themselves could become a century-long gold mine. What Lockheed built would redefine the business of conflict forever. Money could push wars forward, but someone still had to build the machines that made nations unstoppable. That role fell to a company that understood something no one else realized at the time. The future of war would be fought in the sky. Long before jets and satellites existed, the founders of what would become Lockheed saw aviation as the next frontier. They built experimental aircraft in the early 1900s when most planes still looked like fragile wooden frames. World War I gave them their first real opportunity. The government needed reconnaissance planes and early bombers, and Lockheed delivered just enough to stay alive when other aircraft companies went bankrupt. They learned a lesson that would become the foundation of their empire. War might be unpredictable, but military relationships were permanent. Keep the connections alive, and the contracts always return. That strategy paid off the moment World War II erupted. Demand for aircraft reached levels no one had ever imagined. Lockheed built the P-38 Lightning fighter, which became one of the most produced American aircraft of the war. They built bombers. They built patrol planes. They built anything the Pentagon asked for, and the government rewarded them with contracts worth hundreds of millions. But this is where Lockheed changed the game. They realized the Pentagon did not just need planes, they needed political cover. Lockheed hired retired military officers as executives to make sure their proposals were approved by people who already trusted them. They placed factories inside congressional districts where jobs were scarce, and representatives needed wins they could brag about. It was a genius move. If Congress ever tried to cut a Lockheed program, they were also voting to cut their own jobs. No one was willing to take that risk. After the war, Lockheed shifted into Cold War dominance. They built the U-2 spy plane that flew at altitudes enemies could not reach. They built the SR-71 Blackbird that could outrun missiles. They built the C-130 transport aircraft that is still flying today. Every decade introduced a new project, and every project followed the same formula. Underestimate the cost to get the contract approved, then raise the price when the project is too far along to cancel. The government always paid because admitting failure would destroy careers. Lockheed always profited because cost-plus contracts made overruns a source of guaranteed income. One example exposes the entire strategy. The C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft began with a contract in the 1960s. The budget more than doubled by delivery, and Lockheed still made money because every additional cost was reimbursed. Vietnam brought more contracts. The Gulf conflict brought more. Afghanistan and Iraq continued the cycle. By the time Lockheed merged with Martin Marietta in the 1990s, they were already positioned to become the most powerful weapons manufacturer in the world. Today, they dominate the defense industry with billions in annual government contracts because every weapon system leads to another one. The F-35 fighter jet proved the business model better than anything else. It is the most expensive weapons program ever created. The original estimate was a few $100 billion. It has now ballooned into more than $1 trillion, and the program still is not finished. And Lockheed still isn't losing money. The Pentagon keeps paying because the program touches factories in almost every state, which means almost every senator must defend it. Lockheed perfected something the others had only hinted at. War could be engineered as a permanent economic engine, but even they could not fight battles without the companies that supplied everything around the war itself. That world belonged to Halliburton, and their strategy was even more aggressive. Lockheed could build the machines, but wars are not won by machines alone. Armies need food. They need housing. They need fuel. They need roads and bases and entire miniature cities built in the middle of nowhere. And the company that mastered that part of war did not just profit from conflict. They built their entire identity around it. Halliburton began as an oil services company in the early 1900s, but their real breakthrough came when they realized something dangerous. You do not have to fight a war to profit from it. You only need to support it. World War II pulled them into the military world when they built bases, airfields, and ports for the government. The work was massive. The deadlines were impossible, and the Pentagon chose them again and again because no competitor could scale fast enough. Every contract came with one detail that guaranteed profit no matter what happened. Cost plus pricing. Halliburton billed the government for every expense plus a guaranteed profit on top. It was the perfect setup. The more expensive the project became, the more money Halliburton earned. Korea expanded their footprint. Vietnam transformed it into an empire. Through their subsidiary Brown and Root, they built roads, ports, and entire military bases across South Vietnam. Billions in contracts flowed directly to them with almost no competition because their political ties were too strong to challenge. The founders of Brown and Root were major political donors, and one of their closest allies was Lyndon Johnson, long before he became president. When Johnson reached the White House, the company received some of the largest infrastructure contracts of the entire war. Everything was justified under national security. Everything was urgent. And everything was profitable. The pattern only grew stronger in the late 20th century. During the Gulf conflict, Halliburton received contracts to build military facilities across Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. The Secretary of Defense at the time was Dick Cheney. A few years later, he left government and became Halliburton's chief executive. That relationship would shape the next decade of American war. When Cheney became vice president in 2001, Halliburton suddenly found itself in the middle of the largest wave of military spending since World War II. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq opened the door to billions in new contracts. Most were no-bid agreements awarded under the justification of wartime urgency. Some were so large they reshaped the company's entire financial future. By 2008, Halliburton had received over $40 billion in war-related contracts. But the profit was not the shocking part. The waste was. Government auditors reported billions in overcharges, fuel deliveries that never happened, meals billed but never served, construction projects paid for but never completed. Halliburton defended itself by saying combat zones create chaos and inefficiency. The Pentagon agreed, and the contracts kept coming. The company's stock price tripled during the years Cheney was in office, and the former vice president still held stock options worth millions. Halliburton had perfected the art of profiting from war without firing a single shot. They supplied everything except the fighting, and they turned logistics into one of the most profitable businesses in the history of conflict. But Halliburton was not just another opportunistic contractor. They were the final piece in a pattern that had taken more than a century to form. Because once explosives, fuel, financing, weapons, and logistics were all controlled by the same small circle of companies, something inevitable happened. The war economy became permanent, and the pattern behind it became impossible to ignore. That pattern is the heart of everything that comes next. By the time Halliburton joined the game, the system was complete. Explosives had an owner. Fuel had an owner. Financing had an owner. Weapons had an owner. Logistics had an owner. 5 families and 5 industries. All positioned perfectly before a single shot was fired. And once you track their behavior across a century and a half, the same pattern shows up again and again with almost mathematical precision. It always begins the same way. Position before the conflict. DuPont built explosive capacity long before wars erupted. Rockefeller monopolized oil before the modern military existed. Morgan secured government trust before global conflict exploded. Lockheed built its connections before aviation took over warfare. Halliburton built its infrastructure network before the wars of the Middle East. Every company was already in place when conflict arrived. No competitor could match them. Then came the second step. Get the first contract. War makes governments panic. They need supplies immediately. They cannot wait for competitive bidding. And the companies that are already positioned get the earliest and most valuable deals. Once they secure the first contract, the next ones roll in automatically because they are now the proven supplier. The third step is the quiet genius of the model, cost plus pricing. The contractor bills the government for every expense plus guaranteed profit. No risk. No penalty for overruns. The system rewards inefficiency because more cost equals more profit. That leads directly to step 4. Overrun the budget. Every major modern weapon system goes massively over its original estimate. The F-35 did it, the C-5 did it, the Zumwalt did it, the littoral ship did it. This is not incompetence. It is the business model. Underbid to win the contract. Increase costs once the project cannot be canceled. The government pays because admitting failure is political suicide. The contractor profits because cost plus makes overspending a gold mine. Step 5 locks the whole system in place. Hire the regulators. Generals retire from the Pentagon and become executives. Admirals leave the Navy and join shipbuilders. Colonels approve projects while in uniform and then join the same companies after they leave service. It is a revolving door that guarantees loyalty on both sides because decisions made today become job offers tomorrow. Step 6 pushes the entire system from passive profit into active influence. Lobby for intervention. Defense contractors fund think tanks. They finance research papers that argue for military action. They sponsor retired officers who appear on television calling for escalation. They donate to politicians who support intervention and starve those who oppose it. This does not mean they create every war. It means they make war more likely and more profitable. The final step is the one most people never see. Diversify the profit. War money does not stay in war. DuPont used explosive revenue to build a chemical empire. Rockefeller used fuel money to build banks and real estate portfolios. Morgan used war loans to finance industries for the next century. Lockheed reinvested into next-generation technology. Halliburton expanded its global infrastructure footprint. The wars ended. The wealth stayed. And the families became dynasties that still exist today. By the end of these 7 steps, the pattern becomes impossible to deny. A war begins. Stock prices surge. Contracts are awarded. Costs explode. Profits multiply, the war ends, the money stays in private hands, and when the next war arrives, the entire machine resets like clockwork. But the true scale of this pattern is even more staggering. Because once you count the money flowing through these companies, the numbers stop looking like profits and start looking like a transfer of national wealth. That is exactly what the next section uncovers. Once you map the pattern, the next question becomes unavoidable. How much money actually moved through these companies? And this is where the story stops being a pattern and becomes a shock, because the numbers are not just large, they are overwhelming. Across 2 centuries, DuPont earned more than $50 billion in military contracts when adjusted for inflation. Explosives, chemicals, plastics. Every war generated another spike, and every spike became another generation of family wealth. The Rockefeller successors earned more than $100 billion selling fuel to the military since the late 1800s. Every ship, every jeep, every tank, every aircraft, all fed by companies tied to the same dynasty that once controlled 90% of American oil refining. Morgan banks collected more than $70 billion in interest and fees from war financing. They lent money to nations fighting for survival. They structured the loans that rebuilt those same nations once the fighting stopped. They earned profit whether countries won, lost, collapsed, or surrendered. Lockheed and its predecessors took in more than $200 billion in aircraft and weapons contracts since World War I. Fighters, bombers, drones, missiles, surveillance systems, every conflict, every administration, every budget increase, part of it always flowed back to them. Halliburton earned more than $60 billion building bases, feeding soldiers and running the infrastructure of war since the 1940s. From Vietnam to Iraq, they turned logistics into a multi-billion-dollar machine that never slowed down, even when investigators found billions in waste, fraud, and overcharges. Add it all together, and the documented total passes $485 billion. And that is only the public contracts. It does not include stock value. It does not include real estate. It does not include companies they purchased with war profits. It does not include political power gained through donations. If you include those hidden layers, the real number climbs above $1 trillion. Not earned from consumers. Not earned from competitive markets. Taken directly from taxpayers through government spending, pushed forward by conflict. And here is the part that almost no one ever talks about. Every dollar that went to these families came from somewhere else. It came from roads not repaired, schools not funded, hospitals not built, research never completed, college programs never created, entire public systems starved so these companies could feed theirs. $485 billion could pay for free college in America for 2 decades. It could rebuild every bridge in the country. It could fund universal medical care for years. It could finance high-speed rail across the entire nation. It could eliminate entire categories of preventable suffering, but that is not what happened. The money went to wars. Wars that cost lives. Wars that extended because contractors kept getting paid. Wars that were marketed through think tanks funded by the same companies that profited from them. And the darkest part is still ahead. Because when you follow the trail long enough, you reach a final truth. The pattern did not fade over time. It grew. It hardened. It became the backbone of American power. And it still governs every conflict today. The next section reveals why the pattern never stopped. After 2 centuries of contracts, lobbying, influence, and untouchable power, the question becomes simple. If everyone can see the pattern, why does it still exist? The answer is not hidden in secret files or smoke-filled rooms. It is sitting in the open where no one bothers to look. The modern defense industry is bigger than anything the original 5 families could have imagined. In 2023, the United States spent more than $800 billion on the military. More than $200 billion of that went straight to the 5 largest defense contractors. A quarter of the entire defense budget handed to companies whose profit depends on conflict. Lockheed spreads F-35 suppliers across 45 states, so nearly every senator must protect the program. Generals who approve contracts retire into high-paying roles at the same companies. Think tanks funded by contractors promote military action as policy. Politicians receive donations. Executives receive bonuses. The machine feeds itself. This is why investigations never matter. Halliburton is accused of overcharging billions. They pay a fine that is smaller than their profit and keep working. Lockheed is caught bribing foreign officials. They pay a fine and keep building jets. Standard Oil faces accusations of aiding enemy nations during wartime. The company is too important to prosecute. DuPont is investigated for monopoly behavior. Nothing changes. The pattern protects itself because the system depends on it. That is the real reason the pattern never ends. These companies became essential to national defense, too big to challenge, too integrated to remove, too politically connected to restrain. Ending the pattern would require dismantling parts of the American economy itself. So, the machine continues. A new conflict appears, budgets rise, stock prices climb, contracts flow, politicians smile, executives celebrate, families profit, and taxpayers quietly absorb the cost. The pattern was not an accident. It was not a conspiracy. It was a business model perfected over 150 years. A model built on positioning before the conflict, capturing the first contracts, pushing overruns, shaping policy, and keeping the profits long after the war ended. And because the model still works, nothing changes. This is why every generation watches the same story repeat. The same companies, the same strategies, the same results. Even when the motives evolve, the profits remain untouched. Even when the wars shift across continents, the beneficiaries stay the same. The machines grow more advanced, the world becomes more unstable, and the pattern grows even stronger because the world keeps giving it reasons to exist. The real question now is not who profits. We know that. It is not how they profit. The receipts are public. The only question left is whether anyone will ever break the pattern. History says they will not because the people are powerless, but because the pattern has been built into the foundation of American power for generations. War ends. Peace begins. The spending never stops, and the families who shape that system remain the quiet winners of every conflict. If this story changed the way you see war, profits, or power, then you are finally seeing what the pattern was designed to hide.